The Trump administration is supporting an attempted coup in Venezuela, the latest on what's happening on the ground, punishing the president, why one Democratic congresswoman is pushing party leaders to censure the commander-in-chief. And as Campaign 2020 moves forward, more presidential hopefuls are releasing policy agendas. We'll look at one candidate's $5 trillion plan to end climate change. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Chaos in the streets of Caracas tonight as the fight for the future of Venezuela rages on. The situation is fluid now with a government uprising leading to violence. Thanks for joining us for Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
And I'm Jenna Browder. The unrest has been building for months now against President Nicolas Maduro after what many call an unfair election. Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido is backed by many other governments, including the United States.
CBN News national security correspondent Eric Phillips joins us now. Eric, both President Trump and Vice President Pence are offering their support for Guaido on Twitter.
Yeah, that's right, John. The president tweeting this afternoon and saying that he's monitoring the situation closely and that the U.S. stands with the people of Venezuela. Now, the powder keg began to blow this morning after Guaido, who's assumed the role of interim president, called for Venezuelans to hit the streets and take back their freedom. It's the most serious challenge to the current regime to date. Throngs of people answered the call of their leader, clashing with the military over the true leadership of the country. Sounds of gunfire and plumes of tear gas throughout Caracas as the push against dictator Nicolas Maduro and his regime swelled. Flanked by armed guardsmen and prominent activist Leopoldo Lopez, Guaido issued the call to action.
I invite you immediately to activate. I invite you immediately to cover the streets of Venezuela. It is the moment. The moment is now. The moment of not only calm and sanity, but it is also the moment of courage and sanity.
A faction of the country's military that backs Guaido joined the scores of citizens in the effort. The United States and several other nations also recognize him as the interim president until another election can be held. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio tweeting, "After years of suffering, freedom is waiting for people of Venezuela. Do not let them take this opportunity from you. Now is the moment to take to the streets in support of your legitimate constitutional government. Do not allow this moment to slip away. It may not come again." Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying the U.S. government fully supports the Venezuelan people in their quest for freedom and democracy. Democracy cannot be defeated. And National Security Advisor John Bolton wrote, "The end of Maduro's usurpation of power is possible. Venezuela's armed forces should stand loyal to their people and the Constitution." Venezuela's Socialist Party chief went on state TV to defend President Maduro while criticizing the U.S. for supporting the uprising.
What is absolutely evident here is the United States, in the face of ineptitude, in the face of not being able to win elections against the revolution, they prefer a coup without regard for the consequences.
Venezuela's government played down the uprising, saying it was putting down a small coup on attempt by military traitors working with right-wing opponents. But that, quote, small coup, which consisted of a few thousand people, was enough to make Spain close its consulate in Venezuela because of the uncertainty.
Well, Eric, this afternoon, National Security Advisor John Bolton offered a stark assessment of what would happen if Guaido's efforts fail.
Yeah, that's right, John. And Bolton has been tweeting all day long about the importance of this uprising. And here's why. He believes its failure could be final.
I think really now what we're seeing is the people of Venezuela, this has been building for a long time, that if this effort fails, they will sink into a dictatorship from which there are very few possible alternatives. It's a very delicate moment. I want to stress again, the president wants to see a peaceful transfer of power from Maduro to Guaido. That possibility still exists if enough figures depart from the regime and support the opposition, and that's what we'd like to see. We want to see Defense Minister Pedrino, the Chief Judge of the Supreme Court, Raquel Moreno, in particular, Rafael Hernandez Dalla of the Presidential Guard.
As he said, a very delicate moment in history, and all of the eyes of the world are watching. And while the U.S. vigorously supports the opposition fighting for democracy, there are other major powers that support the current regime, including China, Russia, and Turkey. John and Jenna.
All right, Eric, thank you very much. Well, Jason Marzak is the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center at the Atlantic Council, and he joins us now for more. Jason, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jenna.
A lot at stake in Venezuela.
A tremendous amount at stake right now in Venezuela. Today's movements in Venezuela represent potentially the next wave of the ability to actually retake the country for democracy. As said in your report, there are more than 50 countries around the world that recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president. Most major democracies across Latin America, led by the Colombians, the Brazilians, Venezuela's neighbors, as well as most European Union countries as well. The Colombians, in particular, Venezuela's neighbor, have been steadfast in their desire for a return to democracy and for Nicolas Maduro to lead power.
What we're seeing today, Jason, has been a long time coming. You wrote today that Venezuela and the United States should be prepared for the long game when it comes to this push for the fight for freedom. Why did you say that?
Well, because if you look at the history of look at the last 20 years in Venezuela, ever since Hugo Chavez first came to power, and there have been many attempts to wrestle control away from Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro. Of course, now there's added urgency because of the despair in which the country has fallen in the last few years. But things in Venezuela do not change from one day to the next. There is momentum that needs to be built, and there is a longer effort that needs to be seen for democratic forces to prevail. And so even though Maduro will likely remain in the presidential palace at the end of the day today, that doesn't mean that the efforts of the interim government have failed.
Jason, just looking long-term, big picture, what does happen next in the immediate future and in the long term?
Well, in the immediate future, what's going to be critical is that the more than 50 countries that support the interim government are steadfast in their support, and that nothing happens to the interim president, to Juan Guaido. If Maduro were to put him in prison, were to harm him in any way, or others who are close to him. His chief of staff has been in prison actually for over a month now. That could be a potential game changer. You also have multiple international institutions, the Organization of American States, that recognizes the interim government. The Inter-American Development Bank, the primary lender for Latin America, also recognizes the interim government and not Nicolas Maduro. And so you've seen over the last 90 days a groundswell of international support for against Nicolas Maduro and for Juan Guaido, and that support's going to be critical to continue moving forward, and also for mobilizations in the streets in support of the interim government. I think the message that the Trump administration has put out in the last week, we hosted the Atlantic Council last week, the special representative for Venezuela, and that's a message that the future of Venezuela can be inclusive of the military and of members of Chavismo if they take this moment to align with forces of democracy.
Jason Marzak at the Atlantic Council. Jason, thanks for being with us.
All right, thanks for having me.
Well, to campaign 2020, Joe Biden is continuing his push to show America why he should replace Donald Trump in the White House. In an exclusive interview with ABC News' Robin Roberts today, Biden called it an issue of morality in America.
The president has a motto, make America great again. Do you have one?
Make America moral again. Make America return to the essence of who we are, the dignity of the country, the dignity of people, treating our people with dignity, and this god-awful deliberate division that's being taken in order to separating people to aggrandize his own power.
And since announcing last week, Biden has yet to release any firm policy initiatives.
And that's why other Democrats are trying to grab the spotlight by going specific with their agendas. And now one-time top contender Beto O'Rourke is out front with the first comprehensive proposal.
Muy buenos dias from the Yosemite Valley here in California, where we are announcing the most ambitious climate plan in the history of the United States.
The former Texas congressman is trying to reignite his once bright but fading star as the first candidate to lay out a major policy plan. And his focus is on climate change.
I want you to be part of this effort.
The 10-year, $5 trillion plan, he says, would require all Americans to get involved and touch every sector from housing to healthcare and transportation to pensions. The four-part proposal would start on day one of an O'Rourke presidency by recommitting to the Paris Climate Accords and undoing the Trump administration's environmental agenda. It would also raise taxes on businesses and the wealthy to pay for the sweeping plan, which aims to cut carbon emissions to net zero by 2050.
It's hard to argue that there's anything more important facing this country, this generation today.
Naming climate change as the greatest threat America faces, the plan gives O'Rourke the chance to potentially avoid recent characterizations as a political lightweight.
After an initial hot start, O'Rourke has been steadily losing steam in the polls. Well, joining us now is Dan Cox, Research Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dan, thank you for being with us.
Great to be here.
First off, Mayor Pete's immigration plan appears to be pretty vague, but do voters really care about that right now, or is it more about policy at this point in the game?
Well, I think immigration...
I'm sorry, I meant personality over policy.
Personality is going to dominate initially, but I think voters are, particularly in the primary, going to really care about national issues, and immigration is certainly one that's been on the radar for Democrats and Democratic candidates for a long time.
Do you think that'll change as we head into the general election? And will it become, will they ever have to take a firm, for ones who kind of want to, you know, keep it kind of gray, will they ever have to take a firm stance on some of these issues? Or can someone like Joe Biden just sort of scoot in there and take the primary without really giving a lot of details?
Well, I think if you're the front runner, right, and Joe Biden clearly is, according to the CNN and Quinnipiac poll, he's almost at 40% now of support. So I think there's some danger in being out there with a lot of policy proposals that people can attack and take apart. So I think he may be forced to at some point, but for now he's playing it safe.
As you just mentioned with Joe Biden, he's at the head of these polls, but he hasn't gotten very deep with the policies either. So what do you make of that? What's spurring his lead?
Well, I think his 8 years with Obama, really. I mean, if you look at his support, he's actually has greater support among non-white Democrats than white Democrats. And I think that has a lot to do with his 8 years as vice president for Barack Obama. And there's a lot of earned goodwill among Democrats for that.
Dan, your thoughts on Beto O'Rourke's climate plan?
Well, it's certainly an aggressive, comprehensive plan. It's getting critiqued from the left a little bit because it's not aggressive enough. So we're getting some folks who were really supportive of the sort of initial road of the climate sort of energy, which was not, well, it wasn't really a plan, it was sort of an overarching principles. But I think the biggest takeaway is that it's going to be an incredibly important issue. In fact, after healthcare, it's the leading issue for Democrats.
You just, I think, perfectly segued into the next question. What is the issue that these campaign candidates should be talking about as they head into 2020?
Well, healthcare, whether it's Medicare for all or just lowering healthcare costs, is an absolute winner. It was really important and decisive in the 2018 election, and will definitely be important. And Trump's continuing to make it important in the upcoming 2020 race.
Yeah. All right, Dan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Dan. Welcome back. Democratic leadership met with President Trump at the White House today to discuss rebuilding America's infrastructure. They say the president agreed to invest $2 trillion into a new plan. Both House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer described today's meeting with the president as productive.
And it was a very constructive meeting. It's clear that both the White House and all of us want to get something done on infrastructure in a big and bold way. And there was goodwill in this meeting, and that was different than some of the other meetings that we've had, which is a very good thing.
Schumer says infrastructure priorities include roads, broadband, and the power grid.
Well, up on Capitol Hill, a group came together today to defend freshman Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
That's right. The event called Black Women in Defense of Progressive Women in Congress. And the main message they had, they want the president to be censured. Abigail Robertson was there, and she joins us now from Capitol Hill. Abigail, it looked like this crowd got a little bit rowdy at times.
That's right, John. It was a very fired up, rowdy crowd of about 100 people, and they were really calling on Democratic leadership to defend, as you said, freshman Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And both Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib were there and saying how they don't really feel supported by Democrat leadership. Take a look.
The thing that upsets the occupant of the White House, his goons in the Republican Party, many of our colleagues in the Democratic Party, is that they can't stand, they cannot stand that a refugee, a black woman, an immigrant, a Muslim shows up in Congress thinking she's equal to them. When this occupant of the White House chooses to attack me, we know that that attack isn't for Ilhan. That attack is the continuation of the attacks that he's leveled against women, against people of color, against immigrants, against refugees, and certainly against Muslims.
And as you heard her refer to President Trump as the occupant of the White House, she said today, along with the others at the rally, that they do not call him President Trump because they don't believe he deserves that title.
Because when Palestinians are struggling with occupation and their dehumanization isn't being talked about, that is on us to uplift that. So I can't ever speak of Islamophobia and fight for Muslims if I am not willing to fight against anti-Semitism.
Like Ilhan, we refuse to be quiet on the issue of Israel. We contest the conflation of legitimate, impassioned critique of Israel with anti-Semitism, and the fabrication of a notion that when the left calls for justice in Palestine, when the left supports BDS, then it has become the anti-Semitic left.
Congresswoman Omar has taken a lot of heat. Many have viewed some of her comments as anti-Semitic. And as you saw at the rally today, she was unapologetic and kind of dug her heels in. She says she is not anti-Semitic, but she also added that she will continue to speak her mind about U.S. and Israel relations and what she's seeing with Palestine.
All right, Abigail Robertson for us on Capitol Hill. Thank you.
Well, the Trump administration wants to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. The White House saying today the president has consulted with his national security team and leaders in the Middle East and that the designation is working through the internal process. The Muslim Brotherhood has served as a catalyst for other extremist terror groups like Hamas. If the designation is applied, the U.S. would be aligned with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, identifying the Brotherhood as a terror group. It's a regional dividing issue, with governments in places like Turkey and Tunisia backing the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, today I sat down with Senator Mike Lee of Utah. We talked about the administration's announcement on the Muslim Brotherhood, censure, and the possibility of impeachment. Take a look. Well, Senator Lee, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
A group on the Hill is calling for Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi to censor the president over what they see as attacks against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Your thoughts on that?
I haven't seen such attacks. I'm not sure what they're talking about. I do think that anytime you have a member of Congress or another elected official or any other prominent figure speaking on something, I think others have the right to express disagreement with that. Insofar as they're just complaining about public disagreement by President Trump or by anyone else, I don't think that is a good reason to censure someone for criticizing another's speech.
Anti-Semitism making headlines again with the shooting that we saw this weekend in California. Democrats, they recently moved forward with this resolution to condemn anti-Semitism, although some say it hardly actually condemned anti-Semitism, got a lot of criticism for being very watered down. What do you think? Are lawmakers doing enough to call out anti-Semitism?
Well, I think we should call it out wherever it exists, and I don't think we should be afraid to acknowledge the fact that it does exist, and that where it does exist, it's not acceptable.
The president today, he's pushing for the Muslim Brotherhood to be designated as a terror group. What do you think? Is that a good move?
Insofar as the President of the United States believes that that or any other organization is a terror group, I think there's good reason to pay attention. The President does have a fair amount of authority to do that. He's also in a position to receive information about what organizations are supporting terror.
Democrats are very divided on the issue of impeachment. Senator, your thoughts on this? Do you think we'll see any action on the impeachment front?
I don't think so. I think it would be an unwise move for them politically. Really, it is a political question rather than a legal one. Any Congress at any time can decide to make any act that they perceive as wrong an impeachable offense. But if you overreach, if you do so where the American people aren't behind you and where you have no path toward removal, I'm not sure what purpose it serves, and I suspect that if they did it, they would find it to be a political mistake. I think it would end up strengthening the president's position rather than weakening it.
Infrastructure is the topic at the White House today. There's some question, though, if this can actually be an issue where Democrats and Republicans find common ground. I know Mitch McConnell has said he's kind of skeptical of that. What do you think? Can there be consensus on this issue? Can this be a point of unity?
I think it could be a point of unity if we chose to do something that would actually make for more infrastructure, meaning if you could make it easier to get more steel and concrete into the ground so that moms and dads throughout America can spend more time with their families and less time stuck in gridlock traffic to and from work. I think the best way to do that, maybe the only way to do that right now, would be to lower the federal gasoline tax, take it from 18.4 cents per gallon down to 4 cents per gallon. You use that to maintain the existing federal highway system. The remaining 14.4 cents per gallon could be collected and spent by the states as they chose. But what's interesting about that is that money would go another 30 or 40% further than it does with federal money, because it wouldn't be encumbered with all these federal regulations and restrictions on how much you pay employees.
Finally, let's talk about your book, Our Lost Declaration. Tell us about this. What made you decide to write it?
It has occurred to me many times in the last few years that in order to understand the founding of our country, you have to tell stories behind it. And I've written a couple of books about the Constitution. As I researched to write those, I realized more and more that we need to be focusing on the Declaration of Independence. It's as though the Declaration of Independence is the picture, the Constitution is the frame around it, but the picture itself is the Declaration. So it's also occurred to me that there has been a lack of civics education in our public education system. A lot of kids today aren't being taught about Thomas Jefferson, about the Declaration of Independence, about what King George III was doing wrong that led to it, and about the principles about human nature that are embraced in it. So I wrote this book for moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas across America who want their children to be taught the same way they were, to learn these principles of our founding. This book enables them to do that.
All right, Senator Mike Lee, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming together to call on God. How the Jewish and Christian communities are finding peace after the deadly California synagogue shooting.
After the tragic synagogue shooting in California this week, a reminder of hope tonight.
That's right, it comes as the faith community there is joining together, calling for unity.
A piercing sadness and suffering echoed forth in our land, and this time not far away, but here in our own county of San Diego. And yet, a short time later, a much more powerful sound, a sound of resilience and strength and hope, a sign of faith in God, a sign of the willingness to find love even amidst the most trying and horrifying of circumstances.
During the interfaith vigil, people from different Christian denominations joined with the Jewish community to pray, sing, and they also pledged to remain faithful. And that's something I think we can all pledge to do, just to keep them in our minds and in our prayers.
Yeah, in our hearts.
Yep. Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation. Thanks for joining us.
Have a great evening.